Let's knit some square slippers on a double knitting board. Any double knitting board will do. And I call these square slippers because they actually begin as a rectangle. So the name is not literal, but it's only meant to emphasize that it's as easy as knitting a square of fabric, and you will soon see how. Also, these are very thick, warm, and comfy. I'm going to be using this board, which is a custom-made board without a brand name. But any board that will achieve this gauge, 2.5 stitches, 3.5 rows per inch of fabric, may be used with this pattern. Let me show you how I think you can get that gauge on some other common boards. This is the Noble Knitter. It's right now set almost as far apart as it was designed to go. But if you buy extra washers, you can widen this gap a little bit, which you will need to do to get the gauge we're going to use. I am figuring that most people will get the correct gauge with a 7/8 or 13/16 gap in there. Those are two different dimensions, but it's going to vary slightly with your yarn and with your personal style. And I'm referring, let me get something to point with, to the opening between the boards themselves in this case. That's how I measured. So these are kiss washers. No, that one's not. That is a knitting board washer. These are kiss washers. And washers like the ones that come with the Noble Knitter are widely available at the hardware store. Just take some of your hardware and match some so that you can get some extra washers that fit nicely over the bolt and widen this gap. This is an old style knitting board double knitter, and on it I can get the gauge with the smallest spacer used. If for some reason you no longer have spacers, this kind of hardware also fits over these bolts, is also available at the hardware store, and you can just pile them up on the bolt until you get the opening that you need to get 2.5 stitches per inch. This spacer is about a 1 centimeter spacer, so that's what you're basically aiming for. Of course, always swatch. Make sure you're getting the results that you expect. Any kiss loom that can be freed of its pin boards may also be used. This is the extra fine gauge, and it doesn't even have pin boards. So by my estimate, spacing it with 1 1/4 inches between the rows of pegs is likely to get your gauge. You would need a longer bolt than I've got here, but Kiss does provide some. Pile up washers there, put your nut on here, and you're set to go. Also, Kiss sells a double knit kit with everything you need to set up these ends correctly. Since this is the finest gauge, the next gauges up, the pegs are spaced wider and wider apart. So to get the same gauge as you would get on this one, you would need a smaller space like that, adjusting it in or out. On the regular or the small gauge loom, small is not as small as this. I would not recommend trying to use an FG1 or FG2, which are fixed gauge looms with attached pegs, to do this. It is possible, but I think it would just be trickier. Here's what I mean. This is an FG2. I cannot release those pegs. The pins. We want to knit on the pegs, and normally for single knitting we want to use the pins as spacers. But on some of the looms you can remove the pin board because it's separate. On the FG series you cannot. They're fixed gauge. And so this is not the one I would choose. I would either use this extra fine gauge, also known as the FG0, or one of the larger gauge looms, which include the small and the regular. If you cannot match the gauge, you can still make the pattern. What you need to do is take the true circumference of a person's foot. Let's say this is a man with a 10-inch circumference foot. It's a pretty common masculine circumference. For socks, we usually subtract a little bit so that the socks have negative ease for a snug fit. For bulky slippers like this, I do not. If you have to round up or down, I round up in the case of bulky slippers. We normally wear them over socks, and the fabric is not a fabric that's appropriate to wear extra tight. So we'll take his true foot circumference of 10 inches and just say you got 3 stitches per inch. There you go. Simple as pie. Cast on 30 stitches. If you had ended up with a funny number like 31.7, you would call it 32. It could happen if your stitches per inch is not an even number, or the person's foot circumference is not a whole number, like 10 7/8 or something like that. So you can make the pattern whether you match the gauge or not. And here's how you will work it if you do match the gauge. Also, you do not have to scribble madly. I will make an inexpensive file downloadable from Ravelry that reviews this pattern. Here's the yarn I'm going to be using, and it's just perfect. Unfortunately, I do not think you will be able to find the exact yarn. I think it was a limited edition. It's a number 5 yarn, and it is 100% merino wool, so very light and soft, but also dense and warm. Now here's another number 5 yarn in my left hand, and the thickness visually is quite similar, but the density, when I squish them, this one is much less dense and more squishy. So for the purpose of slippers, we want a firm fabric. This, by the way, is Northland Timbers, which I really like a lot for sweaters and things. It's acrylic, alpaca, and wool, and I normally get it from Hirschner's. But I think that you will want a denser, harder yarn for these slippers. It's also possible that yarn labeled the very light end of number 6 will work for you, because this is quite firm. The swatch is everything. That will tell the tale. If you like the fabric you're getting, and it seems dense and sturdy enough for slippers, but it's still not so stiff it's difficult to knit over, then you're in the game. I'm making the ladies size 6. So I'm going to cast on 22 stitches, and I'm going to go over this really fast and just do it as we talk, but I'm not explaining the cast on very much or the stockinette knitting. We're using double board stockinette because there's a whole other video available to you on that, which I'll include in the playlist. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 16, 18, 19, 20. That way, those of you who already know how to cast on and knit stockinette don't have to wait while I explain it. And those of you who do need help with it, to whom it is new, have 17 whole minutes of discussion on the subject. That's the first part of the cast on. Now I'm hanging this other piece of yarn across the stitches. I'm going to knot it underneath. This is the piece of yarn that helps us to control the cast on and the first couple rows of knitting where they're hard to get a hold of. So this next row is still a part of the cast on. It's wrapped just the same as the previous row. And once we knit that over, we will just repeat this all the way to the proper length. I will show you a length chart in a moment that I figured, assuming you get the same number of rows per inch as I do. And I will also tell you how to figure it if you don't. We basically want the slipper as long as the foot is long, plus about 1/2 an inch. It really won't come out 1/2 an inch longer. We want it to come out almost identical to the foot length with just a slight amount of ease, because it is bulky fabric. But we knit it slightly longer because when we draw in the toe, a little bit of length is lost. So if you are trying to adjust the length because you did not get the exact gauge that I got, simply knit to your foot length and then another 1 to 2 rows, and you'll be in good shape. Oops, I got a little spare piece of thread in there. My life is full of spare pieces of thread, I'm afraid. Everywhere I go, my friends pick it off of me. Of course, you can turn the board. This is one of the times that our cord is helpful. I can't really knit over neatly if I don't control the wraps, and they don't control themselves for the first row. This row completes the cast on. Now we have true stitches on every peg, and we count the number of rows if we're counting, starting with the next. I do suggest you count even if you're going to do it to a measurement, because you want to match slipper 2 to slipper 1 exactly. Even if 2 different lengths will fit you, it feels funny on your feet when they're not the same. Pulling down with this cord gets you some control where I can't yet reach in and control things. Now, every row after this row, until the end of the slipper, is wrapped and knitted over just the same. I'll start wrapping. And they get easier and easier because as the fabric drops down, it's easier to hold on to, easier to adjust the stitches to match each other, and so on. All right, let's look at row counts. Here's a quick and easy row chart in case you are in fact getting the row gauge that I am, 3.5 rows per inch. This stands for ladies' sizes, so read across 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and so forth. Men's sizes, the same length does occur in men's sizes, but the numbers are skewed by 2 numbers. So a lady's size 6 is about the length of a men's size 4. So that reads men's sizes all across. And this is the number of rows. 32, 3, 4, 5 for ladies 6, 7, 8, 9, and on up until a men's size 14 or ladies 16 would be 43 rows. Again, you can tweak this to your personal needs and preferences, but those are probably useful numbers for most people. My knitted square is done. Of course, it's really not quite a square. It's slightly rectangular, a little longer than it is wide. But that was easy. Now I have trimmed my yarn tail to about 24 inches long and inserted the end of it into a yarn needle, and we will start gathering off the toe. This is the last stitch that was knitted. Start on the stitch opposite that, pick it up, put it on the yarn needle, and go back and forth across the bed doing this all the way across the work. You could just pull all the work off and then run the yarn needle through, but then you would risk a stitch dropping and running. You could fix it, but this is probably the best way. I've gotten them all onto my yarn needle. Let me pull this through. Make sure everything's free. I caught on a couple of pegs. And remove the loom. Now we want to draw in the toe as much as possible using that last strand of yarn that we ran through as a drawstring. It'll draw in pretty tight, but given the thickness of the yarn, it probably won't close the O completely, and that is okay. We have a plan. When it's as far in as it can go, close it up, and this will be the seam at the top of the foot, this opening now. So center it on the work. It's not difficult. And I'm anchoring it to the bottom of the foot by stitching through the top and then through the bottom. I'm going into the last row of stitches that was also gathered. And I'm going to go back and forth across the toe into those stitches several times. So we'll end up with an almost closed oval, and then we'll seam across that to make the shape of the toe. Just do it until you feel that it is secure enough for your needs, and it's going to vary a little bit based on the specifics of the yarn and the size you made. There's the end of my toe. I don't want any breezes getting into the act. When I'm wearing these slippers, I want to be warm. That should do it. Next seaming trick. Toes closed, but we need to seam these edges together up to about 4 to 5 inches from what will become the back seam. 4 inches in the smaller sizes for lots of ladies, and more like 5 in the larger sizes and for lots of men. See these columns of chain stitches that form right on the edge of double knitting? Each one of them has a bar between the rows of stitches. Those facilitate seaming just beautifully. I'm going to go under that lowest one and pull tight. Under the next one and pull tight. These are a little hard to work into because the toe closure is putting pressure on them, but they get easier. That one's easy. And at this point I can probably start going right, left, right, left before I pull tight, which saves a little time. Not that we're in a rush, but it's nice to make progress. What you want here is to get the seam snug enough that it's draft proof and the fabric looks continuous, which it does. This seam is very hard to see. But if you over tighten it past as snug as is ideal, it will draw the seam in and make it look puckered, either lengthwise or widthwise or both. So as always, there's a happy medium that you're aiming for. That's pretty good. So on up the slipper we go. Here's my first slipper. So my seam length now matches on the second slipper, and it's time to end the seam. This is a stress area. This is where your foot's going to go in and out. So I like to stitch around this area a couple of times to reinforce it. It would be smoother if I did not, but it's going to be stronger because I did, and I care more about that. I don't want it giving up on me in the middle of one cold evening. Now I'm turning the slipper inside out so as to weave in and out a little bit. And because I really do not want this to back out, I'm going to knot it around one of these stitches one time and then weave in and out a little bit farther down. At this point, I'm pretty satisfied with its security. Snip. And I could always stop and correct that or tighten it up or change something, but I've got what I want. These edges are continuous. The knit looks almost as though I knitted it as a tube. It's not pulled in, it's not sloppy. I've got good contact. That's what we're after. Now it's time to seam the back edge of the slipper together. I was using 22 stitches, so we should count down 11. That should be half of them right there. I'm going to pull my anchor cord just to mark my position and double check, because I should have 11 on the other side as well. I did not. Let me double. Oh, I know what I did. I didn't count these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's my halfway point. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Aha! Now, for a moment, I'm going to leave this cord just keeping things neat and pick up the 2 loops that represent one cast-on stitch on one side, then the 2 from the other side of my marked center point, which is here. Pull through. Now back to the right side where I started, pick up, pull through. Back to the left, pull through. I'm using here a smaller crochet hook than I would use to crochet this yarn, just because this is tight. That's a good thing. We want a nice tight seam, but it could get difficult to get the normal size crochet hook for this yarn into it. So on up the back I go. Out time didn't work very well. If that happens to you, just back out and try again. Ready to pull the last cast on loop through. Now there's my initial yarn tail. I'm going to pull it through, and now I'll go through the weaving in process, putting this on my yarn needle. But before I do, it's time to snip this and get rid of it. Just like that. Nice, neat back seam. Here's my yarn tail. I'm stitching across to reinforce and neaten up the top of the seam. And I'm going to go in to the inside and weave in the normal stuff. I really would not like any kind of knot rubbing the back of my heel here. So to make certain that my weaving in doesn't back out without a knot, I'm going back the other direction for a few stitches. Very unlikely to back out now. Voila! And there they are. This one has been on my feet. This one has not. And you can see a slight difference in that this one's already started to mold to the shape of a real anatomical foot. It's not really knitted in that shape, but the fabric is so flexible and so thick and warm. And it's wool, so that helps, but all knitting will do it. They'll take on your foot shape better and better as time goes on. So we're basically done. However, I'm going to make another video showing you how to put a non-slip sole on for safety. It's optional, but you can join me there.